Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. Imagine, for a moment, that you are settling into a quiet evening. The air around you is still, and the world feels hushed. Tonight, I'd like to take you on a slow, unhurried journey into the past, a journey not of glory or kings, but of something quieter, stranger, and often forgotten. We will explore the Wheel of Shame, an iron cage in which prisoners were displayed for all to see. It may sound grim, but do not be alarmed. We will walk through it gently, with calm steps, pausing often to notice not only the cruelty, but also the rhythms of daily life that surrounded it. The purpose is not to shock you, but rather to ease you into a historical landscape, where your mind can drift. Wander, and perhaps find rest. The wheel was more than an object. It was a stage for humiliation, a reminder of authority, and a symbol of how societies once understood justice. In the quiet cadence of our time together, we'll examine its origins, its meaning, and what it felt like to live in its shadow. And as we move through this history, I will keep the pace gentle, allowing your thoughts to meander as if walking slowly through an old town at twilight. So, let us begin. Not with the wheel itself, but with the world that gave birth to it. When we think of medieval justice, it is tempting to imagine dungeons, chains, and secret trials. Yet for most ordinary people, punishment was not hidden away. It was placed directly in the open, where everyone could see it. Justice was not a private matter. It was a performance, a message written in human suffering, and displayed in the center of town. The origins of the Wheel of Shame are found in these older traditions of public punishment. Long before iron cages were hoisted above marketplaces, towns used simpler tools, wooden stocks, pillories, and whipping posts. These were not designed to kill. They were meant to expose. To be placed in the stocks meant that your body became part of the town square itself. Strangers might throw food scraps at you, or simply walk past without a glance. Your punishment was stretched out, not in intensity, but in duration. It is worth remembering that in an age before newspapers, before radio, before the internet, the town square was the center of communication. A punishment carried out there was more than a penalty for the prisoner. It was a broadcast, a message to all who looked on. You can imagine yourself standing quietly at the edge of such a square. The wooden beams of the stocks are dark with use. A man is trapped within them, but there is no shouting, no chaos. Just the soft murmur of market stalls opening, the gentle clip-clop of hooves on stone. And the stillness of someone enduring their shame. This quietness is important. We often imagine punishment as loud and violent, but for many, it was instead a slow erosion of dignity. To stand in the open, to be unable to hide, was a penalty that worked not through force, but through time. These punishments drew upon something deeply human, our awareness of being seen. Even in our own lives, we know the difference between a private mistake and a public one. In medieval times, that awareness was weaponized. To be shamed before neighbors, family, and strangers alike was a heavy burden, perhaps heavier than any chain. Gradually, however, these punishments began to evolve. Town leaders, magistrates, and rulers desired more than mere stillness. They wanted a more striking image, something that would stay in the memory of those who looked upon it. And so, the wheel and cage emerged. It was not enough to place someone at ground level. They would be raised up, made into a display. A grim lantern of justice hanging above the marketplace. But before we get there, let us stay a little longer in these simpler days. Imagine a small village, perhaps in the countryside of England or the hill towns of Italy. The punishments here were not grand spectacles. They were intimate, familiar, woven into the everyday life of the community. A woman scolded for gossip might be placed in a cucking stool, dipped gently into a pond, while laughter rolled across the water. A thief might be made to carry a heavy stone through the town as neighbors watched in silence. These were lessons taught through presence, through endurance, and through the gaze of others. This way of thinking, justice as spectacle, punishment as display, was not unique to Europe. Across the world, societies found ways to make wrongdoing visible. In parts of Asia, criminals were paraded with placards around their necks. In the Middle East, dishonor could be marked publicly with garments or branding. The underlying idea was always the same: shame was not private, but communal, and so, as centuries passed, the wheel and cage became simply the next step in this long tradition. A step harsher, perhaps, but not wholly new. They belonged to a world where punishment was inseparable from community life, where justice was not hidden away in cells but carried out under the open sky. In this way, we can see the wheel of shame not as an isolated invention, but as part of a much older story, a story of human beings grappling with wrongdoing, and using the power of visibility to enforce order. And now, as we move gently into the next part of our journey, we will leave behind the wooden stocks and cucking stools, and instead step closer to the iron cage itself. Its harsh form, its suspended presence, and its unsettling symbolism will unfold before us. But we will approach it slowly, like one might approach an old monument on a quiet evening walk. The iron cage did not appear suddenly, but gradually, as towns sought stronger images of justice. Stocks and pillories, though humiliating, kept the punished low to the ground, at eye level with neighbors. The iron cage was different. It lifted the condemned high into the air, raising them above the crowd, transforming the human body into a hanging warning. The cages were made of iron, sometimes crudely welded, sometimes ornately designed with sharp edges. They fit tightly, so that the person inside could not sit comfortably, could not stretch, could not rest. Suspended from wooden beams or from tall poles, the cage made the prisoner both visible and unreachable. Villagers could look, could point, could whisper, but they could not touch. The body inside became a symbol, untouchable and enduring. For the condemned, this was not a swift punishment. It was a slow unraveling of the body and the spirit. Hunger crept in, thirst pressed against the throat, and the weather wrapped itself around the prisoner, rain soaking clothes, sun burning the skin, winter chilling the bones. And still, they remained on display, suspended above the living rhythm of the town. Children sometimes looked up with wide eyes, curious at the figure above. Merchants, busy with their trade, cast only fleeting glances. Some laughed, some mocked, but many simply carried on. The wheel and cage did not always inspire rage or cruelty, it often became part of the landscape. As common as the marketplace fountain or the tolling of the church bell, yet, for the prisoner, the days stretched unbearably. Time slowed. With no shelter, no escape, the body bore the marks of exposure. Iron pressed against flesh until it bruised, sometimes cut, leaving small threads of crimson along the skin. These stains were not always dramatic. Often, they were subtle, just enough to remind onlookers that flesh was fragile, and that shame carried with it a quiet, physical toll. The cage also amplified silence. Unlike executions, which ended in cries, the cage often held only the whisper of wind and the soft sound of chains creaking. This silence itself became a form of spectacle. The prisoner, unable to act, could only endure, suspended between the ground and the sky, neither fully part of the living nor yet belonging to death. Some cages were used after death. The bodies of executed criminals were placed inside, left to hang above the town as stark reminders. These bodies, motionless, often bore the stains of blood from the executioner's hand. Over time, they became skeletal, a haunting silhouette above the square, as if time itself had taken part in the punishment. And still, the message remained the same: wrongdoing could not be hidden. Justice, in this form, was not carried out in secret chambers. It was written across the open air, etched in the memory of all who passed by. Over time, variations of these cages appeared across Europe. Some were shaped like human bodies, forcing the prisoner into grotesque poses. Others were circular or square, but all shared the same principle: restriction, exposure, and endurance. To the rulers, this was not simply cruelty. It was a lesson, an unmissable signpost of authority. Those who looked upon the cage often felt two things: reassurance and unease. Reassurance that justice was being done, unease at the thought of ever being placed there themselves. In this way, the iron cage worked as much on the viewers as on the prisoner, planting seeds of obedience deep within the mind. The prisoner, meanwhile, became more than a person. They became a symbol, a moving picture of suffering designed to live in memory. The cage transformed flesh into warning, blood into spectacle, silence into echo. And so, the iron cage joined the long tradition of punishments in the open square, but with a new sharpness, a harsher presence, and a more lasting image. Even in its harshness, however, the cage was still part of the everyday world. Farmers, bakers, and children all lived their lives around it. Merchants sold cloth, bells rang, bread was baked, and yet above it all, the prisoner remained, a reminder woven into the rhythm of the town. As time passed, the cage grew to symbolize more than punishment. It symbolized power itself, the ability of rulers to decide who was seen, who was remembered, and who was erased. And yet, as strange as it seems, the iron cage was not always met with outrage. For many, it was simply another part of life. Just as the tolling bells signaled time, so the cage signaled justice. The wheel of shame, in its iron form, stood not as a temporary device, but as a fixture of authority. Its presence told every passerby, wrongdoing could not be hidden, and punishment would always be seen. The iron cage, suspended high above the square, was rarely placed in silence or seclusion. It stood most often in the very heart of the town, the marketplace. This was no accident. The marketplace was the stage upon which daily life unfolded. To place the cage there was to guarantee that no one could ignore it. Every purchase, every trade, every conversation occurred under the watchful presence of punishment. Merchants called out their wares, bakers pulled fresh loaves from ovens, children darted between carts, and still, the prisoner remained above them all. Suspended in plain sight, he became a fixture of the market's rhythm, as ordinary as the toll of the church bell or the ringing of coin in the hand. For the prisoner, there was no escape from this rhythm. Day by day, he heard the murmur of transactions, the clatter of hooves, the laughter of children. Yet he could not participate. He could only endure. The wheel of shame turned daily life into a backdrop for his suffering, reminding him that the world would continue whether he was free or not. Marketplaces were noisy, alive with barter and chatter. Yet amid this noise, the cage introduced silence, a silent body, suspended. Its very stillness made it noticeable, a quiet punctuation in the sentence of the square. At times, the prisoner might be mocked. A rotten apple could be thrown, a harsh word shouted. But more often, the response was one of indifference. People grew accustomed to suffering when it was made routine. The cage taught not only fear, but familiarity. It was a part of life, just as the smell of bread or the ringing of bells was part of life. Still, the prisoner's presence cast subtle ripples through the square. A child might look up in curiosity and ask a question. A traveler, unfamiliar with the town, might pause uneasily, unsettled by the sight. These moments revealed that the cage was not just for the condemned. It was for all who looked. For the rulers, this was precisely the purpose. The cage was not simply a punishment, it was a reminder, an ever-present sermon. The iron bars, the crimson stains, the silence above, it all whispered a message: disobedience would not remain hidden. As the day moved on, shadows shifted across the cage. In the morning light, the iron gleamed. At noon, the sun pressed down harshly. By evening, the cage became a silhouette against the darkening sky. The cycle of the day became the prisoner's world, and the blood upon his skin became part of the scenery, seen in different light each hour. Sometimes, the cage was turned deliberately into a spectacle. A festival day might see greater crowds gathering in the square. In those moments, the prisoner became part of the entertainment, a harsh reminder that joy and suffering often stood side by side. Other times, the cage stood almost forgotten. Weeks could pass, and the figure inside became little more than part of the town's architecture, a shadow against the church tower, a figure half ignored, half remembered. The cage did not always hold the living. At times, bodies were left after death, still suspended as grim guardians of the marketplace. Bones clattered softly against iron as the wind blew. These silent remains carried their own message. Even death could not erase shame. For the living prisoner, however, blood was not only a mark of violence. It was also a reminder of frailty. Each crimson stain told the story of flesh pressed against unyielding iron, of wounds that reopened daily as the body shifted. Yet still, daily life moved on. The cage, the blood, the silence, they became part of the scenery. In this way, punishment blended with routine, and suffering stood side by side with ordinary joy. It is easy, from our perspective, to imagine outrage at such cruelty. But for those who lived within it, the wheel of shame was simply one piece of their world. Just as the bell rang each hour, just as bread was baked each morning, so too did the cage stand above the square, and so, in the marketplace, the wheel of shame found its true home, not in hidden dungeons, but among bread, laughter, bargaining, and song. Its cruelty was balanced not with silence, but with the ordinariness of daily life, a paradox that made its presence all the more enduring. If we have so far looked at the wheel of shame from the outside, it is now time to shift our gaze inward. To imagine what it was to live inside those iron bars, suspended above the rhythms of the town. From below, the cage was a symbol. From within, it was a world, a small, confined, and merciless one. The cage was rarely large. It pressed against the body, limiting movement until every gesture became an ache. Iron against skin, wood beneath feet, and air that shifted with the day, cold in the morning, hot by noon, damp by nightfall. A prisoner lived in cycles of discomfort. And yet, what made the punishment heavy was not only the physical strain. It was the gaze. Day after day. The eyes of strangers passing beneath you, measuring you, remembering you, forgetting you. From this perspective, the marketplace no longer seems lively. The voices below blur into a constant hum. Children laugh, animals bray, merchants argue over weights of grain, and yet none of it belongs to the prisoner. He is there, and yet not part of it, a shadow above daily life. Nights were worse. With the sun gone, the town grew quiet, and the prisoner was left alone with the cage itself. Rats scurried below. The wind moaned through iron gaps. Sleep, if it came at all, came shallow and restless. And still the body was not permitted privacy, for even in darkness, the cage stood as a silhouette against the moonlight. The weight of shame was as real as the iron. Imagine the stillness of your own body when you know you are watched. The slow, careful movements. The guarded posture. Inside the cage, every gesture became performance, not by choice, but by necessity. The prisoner learned to conserve energy, to let the hours drip by. To survive not with strength, but with stillness. There were small mercies. Sometimes a passerby would hand up bread, or a child might throw an apple, half-rotten but still edible. Other times, water would be poured into a cup tied to a rope. These gestures, rare though they were, became lifelines. Not of kindness alone, but of recognition, reminders that even in punishment, one was still human, but more often, what fell from below was not bread but refuse. Scraps, stones, or the casual spit of a passerby. Cruelty was as much a part of the cage as the iron itself. For some, the punishment was an opportunity to remind the prisoner of his place, not just beneath the law, but beneath the judgment of all. What made the wheel of shame distinct from other punishments was time. The cage stretched punishment into days, sometimes weeks. There was no climax, no final blow of the sword or snap of the rope. Only the long, drawn-out erosion of dignity. The prisoner watched life continue without him, the marketplace blooming and fading each day like the rhythm of a tide. The body weakened. The cage did not allow comfort, and so muscles stiffened, sores opened, and the skin bruised where metal pressed too tightly. Hunger hollowed the face. Thirst cracked the lips. And yet, for many, it was the humiliation, not the hunger, that bit deepest. From above, the prisoner looked down not only at strangers, but often at family. A wife, unable to intervene. A child, too young to understand. Neighbors, both familiar and distant, passing beneath. Each glance reminded him that punishment was not private. It was carried out not only on the body, but on the web of relationships that bound a life together. The cage was not meant to kill, though sometimes it did. A body deprived of water, food, or shelter might not survive long. When death came, it was slow, and it too became a display. For if punishment was a performance, so too was its end. The cage, once filled with living presence, became a vessel for decay, and yet, we must resist imagining only cruelty. For some prisoners, the cage was temporary, a sentence endured and survived. To descend again to the ground, to feel earth beneath the feet, to drink deeply of water, such things could feel like rebirth. The wheel did not always end in death. Sometimes it ended in return. If we look closely, the wheel of shame was not only a tool of authority, but a mirror of the community itself. How people treated the prisoner reflected what they valued, what they feared, and what they believed justice should look like. In its iron stillness, the cage transformed the prisoner into something both human and symbolic. A reminder that justice was not hidden, that shame was not private, that the line between survival and ruin was thin. And as we leave this perspective, we must remember, the wheel of shame was not only about the cage itself, but about the theater it created. The marketplace was the stage. The community, the audience. The prisoner, the unwilling actor. And time was the cruel script. In the next part of our journey, we will step down once more from inside the cage, and look instead at those who gathered around it. For if the prisoner lived within the bars, the townspeople lived outside them, shaping the meaning of what they saw. If the prisoner was the centerpiece of the wheel of shame, the crowd was its frame. Without the eyes of the community, the cage would have been only a container. With them, it became theater. To gather beneath the iron bars was not simply to witness punishment, but to participate in it. The presence of the crowd gave weight to the shame. The marketplace was the natural stage for this gathering. Cobblestones worn by centuries of footsteps, the scent of bread and salted fish, the clamor of trade, all of these provided the backdrop. And above it, suspended in stillness, hung the cage. For the crowd, it was both an interruption and a spectacle, something woven into their daily routine. Crowds came for many reasons. Some arrived with curiosity, eager to see the condemned. Others lingered out of habit, stopping briefly on their way to the baker or blacksmith. There were those who came with judgment, and those who came with pity. In their presence, the punishment became layered, a complex blend of human responses. Children, especially, were drawn to the spectacle. They darted between adults, peering upward with wide eyes. Some laughed, not yet understanding the weight of what they saw. Others grew quiet, unsettled by the sight of a human displayed so helplessly. For them, the cage was a lesson, though not always one intended. Not everyone in the crowd was anonymous. Family members sometimes stood beneath the cage, their presence sharp and heavy. A wife clutching her shawl tighter. A brother standing in silence, jaw clenched. Their presence changed the tone of the punishment, turning it from spectacle into personal grief. Vendors and tradesmen also took part, though more passively. The cage was simply part of the square, as familiar as the fountain or the church steps. For them, life continued. They sold their goods, they measured coins, and yet all the while, their eyes flickered upward, brief acknowledgments that punishment lived among them. Sometimes the crowd became more than an audience. They became actors in the punishment itself. Food scraps, insults, and stones were hurled upward. Yet at other times, kindness appeared in equally small gestures, a child whispering a prayer, or an old man bowing his head in quiet sympathy. The crowd reflected the spectrum of human nature. There was also an unspoken ritual to the crowd's movement. At dawn, when the market opened, the prisoner became part of the scenery. By noon, the heat drew more onlookers, laughter and shouts rising. By evening, lanterns glowed, and the cage took on a darker, ghostly shape against the twilight. For some, the cage was entertainment. In an age without theaters in every town, without traveling spectacles each week, the wheel of shame was a grim form of drama. To stand beneath it was to see human frailty displayed openly. Yet even entertainment had lessons embedded within it. Others saw it as a moral reminder. Priests would sometimes preach near the cage, using the prisoner as a living sermon. Sin, they would say, leads not only to divine punishment but to earthly shame. For the crowd, this linked justice not only to law, but to faith. Crowds also created memory. For weeks after, villagers would recall the sight, the face of the condemned, the way he hung in stillness, the sound of jeers or silence. Stories spread outward, from the town square to distant villages, magnified with each telling. The cage was not only a spectacle for the crowd, it was also a message from those in power. Behind the creaking chains and iron bars stood authority, magistrates, lords, and councils who saw the wheel of shame as more than punishment. For them, it was policy, law, and strategy. The cage reminded people that justice was not private vengeance. It was a power greater than any one person, wielded by rulers on behalf of the entire community. In this way, the wheel became an emblem of order, a visible reminder that law had teeth. Authority also sought permanence. Stocks and whippings were temporary, but the cage lingered. It hung for days, sometimes weeks, visible long after the sentence was declared. This duration gave rulers something powerful: memory. A single punishment echoed for years through whispered stories. The cage was also about deterrence. It was not only the condemned who suffered, but everyone who looked upon them. A thief seeing the dangling body would think twice before stealing. A rebel might reconsider rising against the Lord. The iron bars spoke a language sharper than words. For rulers, justice was also theater, and theater required staging. The cage was deliberately placed in visible spaces, above market stalls, near church doors, or at the town gates. These locations ensured that no one could ignore the message. Authority was not hidden in chambers, it was displayed in steel and stone. Even weather played into the intentions of authority. Rain streaking across iron bars, snow collecting on shoulders, summer heat baking the air, all were part of the punishment. The cage turned the elements into enforcers, reminding all who watched that nature itself could be weaponized by law. Authority also understood symbolism. Iron was not chosen by accident. It was hard, unyielding, and cold. The cage, like the law, was meant to feel eternal. Wooden stocks rotted, ropes frayed. But iron endured, just as rulers wished their justice to endure. The wheel of shame also carried an implicit warning: authority could raise you up, but it could just as easily leave you hanging. To see a man elevated in the marketplace was to see a reversal of status. Yesterday, he might have been a neighbor. Today, he was an example. At times, rulers staged executions and punishments deliberately closed together. The cage served as a reminder even when the gallows was empty. It said, the law does not sleep. Authority does not forget, and so, the cage became a voice of authority, louder than speeches, longer lasting than decrees. Every creak of its chains was a whisper of law. Every rust stain on the stone beneath it was a mark of memory. By turning justice into spectacle, rulers bound themselves to the crowd. They needed eyes to witness, voices to spread the story, and memories to keep the fear alive. Without the people, authority was hollow. With them, the cage became power embodied. Thus, the wheel of shame was not only a punishment but a mirror, reflecting both the weakness of the condemned and the strength of those who commanded the cage to rise. When we picture punishment, we often imagine sudden violence, a sword descending, a lash across the back, or the crash of a door as a prisoner is dragged away. But the wheel of shame was built upon a very different rhythm. It was not swift. It was not loud. It was slow, and in its slowness lay its true power. Suspended above the market square or mounted upon a tall post by the town gates, the iron cage was less a moment and more a season. Time itself became the executioner. What the magistrate declared with words, the days and nights carried out with silence. The prisoner inside the cage lived not in hours, but in erosion. Each passing moment carved at dignity and body alike. Hunger arrived slowly. Like a creeping shadow. Thirst thickened the mouth until even rainwater running down the cage's bars seemed like salvation. Exhaustion pressed down, yet sleep rarely offered peace. Cold air in the night seeped through every joint. Heat in the day burned without shelter. It was not the blow of a weapon but the steady weight of days that crushed the spirit. For those who passed beneath the cage, the sight was both familiar and strange. Familiar because the body became part of the square, like the well, the stalls, the stone steps. Strange because each day, it looked subtly altered. A face more tired. Shoulders slumped lower. Clothes sagged with filth and rain. The process of decay was slow enough to be witnessed but too gradual to be stopped. The people of the town were, in a sense, watching time itself do its work. This was the cruelty of the wheel of shame. It was not only punishment but a reminder of transience. Just as a candle guttered slowly into darkness, so too did a prisoner fade before the community's eyes. And when eventually the cage fell silent, the emptiness it left behind carried the memory of days, not moments. It is worth pausing here. Imagine yourself standing beneath such a cage at night. The market is empty, the stalls closed, the cobblestones glistening faintly with dew. Above you, the prisoner shifts weakly, chains creaking in the stillness. There is no crowd, No noise, only the sound of breathing, shallow and weary. The punishment is no longer a spectacle. It is simply time. Time, of course, brought with it not only exhaustion but the work of nature. Rain gathered rust upon the bars. Sun bleached fabric into dullness. Wind cut into the skin, reddening and chapping. Even insects became participants, drawn by sweat, wounds, or stillness. The cage was not only an invention of men but a stage where the natural world played its part. Seasons too made their mark. In summer, the air beneath the cage thickened with heat, and the body within shimmered under the relentless sun. In autumn, falling leaves collected at the foot of the post, their quiet decay echoing the prisoner's decline. Winter wrapped everything in frost, each breath of the condemned visible as a fragile cloud. Spring, even with its blossoms, brought little mercy, for growth and renewal carried a cruel contrast to suffering above. Villagers learned to live with these images. The cage, for all its horror, became part of daily rhythm. Children played marbles near its shadow. Merchants haggled with customers at stalls below. A passing bell might chime from the church, mingling with the faint creak of chain. It was not constant spectacle. It was background, lingering, steady, like the tolling of a slow bell that never fully ended. For the prisoner, time in the cage became a paradox. Each day stretched endlessly, yet each day also erased them bit by bit. There was no escape from the gaze of others, nor from the indifferent touch of wind and rain. In a way, the punishment was both public and profoundly lonely. Surrounded by people, yet isolated above them. Visible, yet unreachable, and then, there was the sound of time. The steady groan of chains. The occasional rattle when the wind pushed the cage. The soft shuffle of feet on stone as villagers passed. Time was not silent, it had a voice, subtle and relentless. Sometimes, prisoners spoke. Pleas for water. A groan of pain. A muttered prayer. But often, words fell away, replaced by silence. Silence that seemed to thicken with every passing day. For those watching, the absence of speech was as striking as speech itself. The prisoner became less a person and more a figure of endurance, fading into a symbol rather than a voice. Decay also worked upon the cage itself. Rust bit deeper, joints stiffened, and would crack beneath iron's weight. Over time, some cages became semi-permanent landmarks, long outlasting the life of the prisoners inside them. They stood as monuments to punishment, empty, yet still eloquent. When finally the cage was emptied, whether by death, release, or decay, the silence it left behind was its own kind of echo. Townsfolk passing the vacant space could still recall the sight. The air seemed marked, as though memory itself had weight. Time, then, was the true executioner of the wheel of shame. Not a sudden blow, not a flash of steel, but the slow accumulation of days. It punished not through force but through duration. In this way, the cage reflected something universal, that endurance itself can be its own kind of trial, and perhaps this was why the wheel of shame endured for centuries. It was not only cruel but effective, for memory clings to what unfolds slowly. Just as water shapes stone not through sudden force but through years of repetition, so too did the cage shape the memory of the community. Here, we will leave behind the prisoner's silence and instead listen to the voices of communities, chroniclers, and travelers who looked upon the wheel of shame and recorded what they saw. To understand the wheel of shame fully, we must step outside the cage itself. We must listen to the voices of those who looked upon it, recorded it, or sought to interpret its meaning. For punishment was never only about the condemned. It was about the community, the rulers, the faith of the time, and even the visitors who passed through. The iron cage, suspended above the square, was a mirror. In its bars and its prisoners' suffering, each society saw something of itself. In some towns, chroniclers described the cage as a symbol of order. It represented the authority of rulers and magistrates, the assurance that wrongdoing would be answered with visibility. To see the cage was to see law itself, not hidden in scrolls. Not whispered in courts, but made flesh and iron. In other places, however, the cage carried a darker symbolism. It was whispered about in taverns, feared by travelers, dreaded by merchants. Children pointed upward and asked questions that parents could not easily answer. The sight of a body slowly wasting away above the square did not only instruct, it unsettled. Foreign travelers left behind written impressions. A German merchant passing through Italy might remark upon the cruelty of cages in hill towns. An English pilgrim journeying through France might describe the sight of a man swaying above a bridge, suspended over rushing water. Their words, carried home, became stories told in other marketplaces. Spreading the cage's reputation far beyond its iron bars, within each community, attitudes toward the cage varied. Some saw it as necessary justice. Others saw it as excess. A widow might look upward and whisper a prayer for the prisoner's soul. A farmer might shake his head and mutter that the sight frightened his children. Yet few ignored it completely. The cage demanded a response, even if that response was silence. Clergy, too, weighed in. Some priests approved, declaring that public shame was a necessary reminder of sin and consequence. The body in the cage became a sermon without words. But others hesitated. Was such exposure merciful? Did it turn punishment into spectacle rather than correction? Theologians debated quietly, even as iron cages continued to hang in public squares. Over time, the cage also entered folklore. Songs and rhymes, often grimly humorous, began to reference it. Children dared one another to run beneath it at night. Ghost stories spoke of prisoners who never left their cages, still rattling in the wind long after their bodies were gone. In these tales, the cage transcended punishment, it became myth. Symbolism deepened further when cages were placed not only in markets but at the edges of towns, near bridges, or upon hills. These served as warnings not just to townsfolk, but to outsiders. Here lies justice, the cage declared, and here is what awaits the disobedient. For travelers, the sight was chilling, to enter a city and see not a gate but a suspended body. Not all cages held living men. In many places, the bodies of executed criminals were displayed after death. Thieves, rebels, or even pirates were left to swing in cages, their remains weathered by time. For these societies, the cage was not merely punishment but deterrence beyond the grave. The body became a warning long after the soul had departed. For rulers, the cage was political theater. A lord might order a rebel displayed not to correct him, for his fate was sealed, but to instruct others in obedience. In this sense, the cage was propaganda in iron form. It told every passerby where power lay, and what awaited those who challenged it. Yet despite its harshness, the cage was not always accepted quietly. There are records of towns petitioning for its removal, of neighbors growing weary of its sight, of families begging magistrates for mercy. Resistance was often subtle, not open rebellion, but discomfort voiced in whispers, in prayers, in avoidance of the square. Traveling poets and moralists sometimes seized upon the image of the cage to make larger points about life itself. Just as a man in iron was exposed to the world, so too were all human sins exposed before God. The cage became a metaphor for the fragility of pride, the futility of rebellion, the slow passage of time. It was more than punishment, it was allegory. By the late Middle Ages, cages were recognized across Europe as a distinct form of justice. They appeared in chronicles, court records, and artistic depictions. Painters sometimes included them in cityscapes, tucked away in corners, a reminder that beneath beauty and prosperity lay fear and discipline, and yet, reactions remained complex. For some, the cage was justice perfected, visible, enduring, memorable. For others, it was cruelty refined, too slow, too public, too merciless. The same object that reassured one villager unsettled another. The same iron that spoke of order to a magistrate spoke of fear to a child, over centuries, as laws shifted and punishments changed. The cage lingered in memory. Even when dismantled, stories of it lived on. In villages where no iron hung anymore, people still pointed to old beams and said, "There once stood the wheel of shame." Thus, the cage outlived itself. And so, when we look at the cage today, whether in ruins, in chronicles, or in reconstructed imagination, we must see not only iron and pain. We must see culture. We must see the villagers who prayed, the rulers who ordered, the travelers who whispered, the poets who reflected. The cage was never only about its prisoner. It was about everyone who looked up at it, and what they chose to see. By the time the cage had become a fixture of towns and chronicles, it had already begun to slip beyond its practical use. The wheel of shame, and its countless variations, no longer belonged only to law. It had entered the imagination. Once lodged there, it could not be contained. The cage was more than iron and body. It became metaphor, myth, symbol. Artists, storytellers, and villagers alike began to use it as a canvas for meanings far greater than any single punishment. In sermons, priests compared the cage to the prison of sin. Just as the prisoner swayed helplessly before the eyes of his neighbors, so too, they said, did sinners sway before the gaze of God. To be trapped in iron was to be a reminder that divine justice, like earthly justice, saw all. Storytellers adapted the cage into their tales. Ghost stories multiplied, spirits that rattled in abandoned cages, condemned souls who never found peace because their shame had outlived their flesh. In some towns, the wind that whistled through the bars was said to carry whispers of the damned. The cage also became a metaphor for politics. Rebels wrote songs comparing their people to prisoners in a great iron frame, suspended by rulers who delighted in control. To them, the cage was not about criminals at all, but about power, and those who suffered beneath it were symbols of oppression. Even in art, the cage's shape echoed beyond punishment. Illuminated manuscripts used the image of iron bars to frame allegories of temptation or pride. The body within the cage became a universal figure, the everyman, caught in his own flaws, displayed for eternity. In allegory, the cage was often linked with time. Unlike the sword or the gallows, which struck swiftly, the cage eroded dignity slowly. Thus, poets wrote of the cage as a reminder of mortality itself, life stretched out, visible, unrelenting, ending only when the body gave way. For common villagers, the cage's mythic power lay in its visibility. It was always there, whether occupied or empty. The mere sight of it was enough to create stories. Children asked, "Who will be next?" Lovers whispered, "What crime would place us there?" Merchants joked, "Best not haggle too hard, or you'll end in iron." The cage lived in speech as much as in sight. Over time, legends arose of those who defied the cage. Some spoke of prisoners who survived weeks longer than expected, turning their endurance into legend. Others told of cages struck by lightning, shattering as if heaven itself rejected them. Whether true or not, these tales gave the cage a supernatural edge. Folklore expanded further. In some regions, the cage became associated with witchcraft. A woman placed in a cage might later be remembered as a sorceress whose spirit haunted the bars. Cages found abandoned in forests were said to hold spirits of those unjustly punished. The iron itself seemed to absorb stories, becoming enchanted by human memory. Artists of the Renaissance, looking back, reimagined the cage as allegory for ambition. To rise above others, as the cage hung above the town, was not always glory. It could also mean exposure, danger, and eventual ruin. The cage became a warning against reaching too high. Philosophers later took the cage into their writings. They argued that true punishment lay not in chains but in shame. And that society itself was a cage, a place where every man was watched, measured, judged. Here, the iron frame became a metaphor for civilization itself. In myth, the cage even merged with cosmology. Some told of hell as a cage of fire, souls suspended forever above the abyss. Others spoke of purgatory as a long, public shame, endured until atonement was complete. The cage thus became not only earthly punishment but a vision of the afterlife. As centuries passed, the cage's presence in everyday justice diminished. But in story, art, and symbol, it grew larger. It appeared in plays, in woodcuts, in allegories. It became part of the European imagination, a shorthand for shame, exposure, and suffering. Even where no iron remained, the idea endured. Thus, by the modern era, the cage lived more as legend than as law. It was remembered not just as a punishment, but as a symbol. A symbol of power, of shame, of mortality, of sin, of society itself. It transcended its purpose, as all enduring symbols do, and so, when we speak of the wheel of shame today, we must see not only its iron bars. We must see the myths it carried, the allegories it inspired, the fears it whispered into generations of hearts. It was never only about punishment. It was about imagination. The cage became not only a tool of justice, but a mirror for humanity itself, its fears, its pride, its longing for meaning. By the dawn of the modern age, the wheel and cage, once fixtures of town squares, began to vanish. Their iron silhouettes no longer swayed above markets. Their groans and rattles no longer echoed across cobblestones. This disappearance was not sudden, nor was it merciful. The age of the Enlightenment brought with it new ideas about punishment, that justice should reform rather than display, that the body need not be paraded for the crowd in order for law to function. In England, France, and beyond, punishment moved indoors, into prisons, workhouses, and courtrooms. What had once been the open theater of shame became the closed chamber of bureaucracy. Justice no longer needed an audience. It needed paperwork, walls, and discipline. The cage was simply too visible, too raw for this new world. Reformers saw it as barbaric, an echo of darker times best left behind. And so, town by town, the iron frames were dismantled, scrapped, or left to rust, yet even as the cages themselves decayed, they survived in memory. Travelers of the 18th and 19th centuries recorded seeing them, half forgotten, in the corners of villages or dangling from ruined towers. Writers described them with fascination, as relics of a brutal but captivating age. It is here that the cage transformed once more, from punishment into nostalgia, from tool into relic. The very thing once feared became, in time, a curiosity. Just as medieval swords turned into museum pieces, so too did the wheel of shame become an artifact to be studied, not dreaded. But even as it faded physically, the cage endured in art, literature, and above all, in the imagination. Gothic novels used the cage as scenery. Painters used it as allegory. Poets used it as metaphor. The cage had slipped from the square into the psyche, where it remains to this day. And here, perhaps, lies the most unsettling truth: though the iron is gone, the logic of the cage still lingers in us. Medieval towns sought to punish by making wrongdoing visible. Today, though we no longer hoist criminals above marketplaces, we have built new stages of shame, digital ones. Public punishment has not ended. It has only changed its form. Instead of iron bars, we now use screens. Instead of the town square, we use the internet. The audience is no longer the villagers but millions of strangers across the globe, and just like in medieval days, the punishment is not always physical, but social, emotional, and deeply human. The cage has become digital. This continuity reveals something about us. We still hunger for spectacle. We still respond to the sight of someone displayed, helpless, before our collective gaze. Where once we hurled rotten fruit, now we hurl comments, insults, and endless judgment. The internet has become a town square without end, and the cage has become a metaphor for what it feels like to be shamed in it. But there is another layer. The cage also survives in the way we understand ourselves. Modern psychology often speaks of the social cage, the invisible structures of expectation, shame, and exposure that shape our behavior. Just like those medieval prisoners, we know the weight of being watched, even our architecture remembers. Panopticons, surveillance systems, and prisons designed for constant visibility all echo the same principle: to be seen is to be controlled. The cage, though gone in form, remains in function, and yet, we are also haunted by its ghost. Stories of medieval cages still attract readers, viewers, and tourists. Reconstructed cages in museums and theme parks draw crowds. We stare not with horror, but with fascination. Perhaps we recognize something in them, a reflection of ourselves. The cage thus lingers in two ways, as history, and as metaphor. As history, it reminds us of a world where justice was public and merciless. As metaphor, it reminds us that shame, exposure, and spectacle remain deeply human forces. Even today, when we speak of being trapped, of being put on display, of being caged, we echo medieval justice. We carry its language, its imagery, and its weight, and so, the decline of the cage was not its death. It was its transformation. From iron to symbol, from square to screen, from punishment to metaphor. The wheel of shame did not end. It simply turned. Perhaps this is why we still look at those empty cages in museums with fascination. We recognize not just the brutality of the past, but also the persistence of its spirit. The cage is us, our hunger for order, our fear of exposure, our awareness that dignity is fragile, and so, as the story closes, we leave the iron behind but carry its shadow. The wheel of shame belongs to the Middle Ages, yes, but it also belongs to us, here and now. Every public scandal, every viral humiliation, every act of collective judgment is a faint echo of the same principle: justice as spectacle, punishment as display. The cage, once iron, now lives in memory and metaphor. And perhaps that is the most powerful form of all. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,